Good evening, and welcome back to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, the creator and narrator of Dead Sleep, and if you're new to the podcast, Dead Sleep is a unique true crime podcast where the only case we're here to solve is your case of insomnia. I mentioned at the end of the last episode that tonight's story was going to be a case that took place in Paris. But we'll have to temporarily postpone our Paris trip because the story, like a good French cassoulet, needs a little more time to simmer to get just right. But that's okay. When things don't go as planned, you don't lose sleep over it. You come up with something else. Tonight's episode is like a sleepy true crime history lesson. It's inspired by a curiously influential psychological thriller. A movie that was released 80 years ago, and yet is more relevant than ever. It's a movie called Gaslight. You likely know what gaslighting is. It was Merriam-Webster's word of the year back in 2022. And the dictionary definition of gaslight is psychological manipulation of a person, usually over an extended period of time, that causes the victim to question the validity of their own thoughts, perception of reality, or memories, and typically leads to confusion, loss of confidence and self-esteem, uncertainty of one's emotional or mental stability, and a dependency on the perpetrator. Now, that's an elaborate way to say gaslighting is a way to make someone feel crazy. Gaslighting is at the root of all of true crime. The story of Dirty John immediately comes to mind, but there are countless other stories of how master manipulators weaponize the trust of another person for their own gain, tricking them into questioning their own judgment and sanity. But where specifically did the word gaslight come from, and how did it find its way into popular culture and pop psychology? We'll get to all of that in this very calm, cool, and collected origin story of gaslighting. So with that, let's settle in for the night. Get cozy under those covers, close your eyes, and get ready to fall dead asleep with Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. Imagine for a moment if you were told your whole life that you are secretly Scottish aristocracy, and that your father was the rightful heir to the throne of Scotland. And you and your siblings were being bred for the high society life that you deserved. But in your day-to-day reality, it didn't look like Scottish royalty. Your father drank too much. Your family never had any money. And you never lived in a castle, but in a series of shabby boarding houses along the coast of England. What you were told by the people closest to you was clearly a lie, but you were told it was true, so you had to act like it was true, which meant your life was a performance made complicit by your entire family, a shared delusion, one that created a feeling of dissonance, of confusion, of anxiety, and of loneliness. This dissonance, this clash between fact and fiction, was the early life of a novelist and playwright named Patrick Hamilton. Patrick Hamilton was born in Sussex, England in March of 1904. He was already pretty successful when he wrote Gaslight in 1938 as a stage play. The story isn't about Hamilton's family, it's about a couple, but it captures the disturbing power of a false narrative. And that play would go on to become two extremely successful movies, a British film made in 1940, and the more famous Hollywood version that was produced 4 years later in 1944. That movie features some of the greatest cinematic talent in the history of Hollywood. It was directed by George Cukor, known for The Women and My Fair Lady. The film starred Ingrid Bergman, whom you know from Casablanca and Isabella Rossellini's mom, and Charles Boyer, a French-American actor whose signature voice was so resonant, so romantic, and so French, that the character of Pepe Le Pew was based on Boyer. The movie also features a young Angela Lansbury in one of her first, if not her first, feature role. A bit of foreshadowing for a career that would include Murder, She Wrote and Sweeney Todd. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that this movie also starred one of the all-time greats of black and white movies, and one of my favorite actors, Joseph Cotten. Joseph Cotten co-starred with Orson Welles in The Third Man, a film noir classic written by the British legend Graham Greene, who was, just to bring things full circle, a huge admirer of the Gaslight writer Patrick Hamilton. The Hollywood version of Gaslight is a little different than the British one. The British version adheres more closely to the original play, but the Hollywood version is more broadly known. It's the one most referenced when we talk about the phenomenon of gaslighting. So I'm going to focus on that plot for the next several minutes. The movie Gaslight is described as a psychological thriller. There's very little physical violence in the film, but the mental torment is excruciating. And while it was made in the 1940s, the story is situated in Victorian-era England, London in the 1880s. A world of darkness and shadows, illuminated by the soft and eerie glow of the only source of energy before electricity: gaslight. Gaslight opens with a murder, the headline blaring from the front page. It's October 1875. A murder that just happened in an area known as Thornton Square and remains unsolved. The woman murdered was a famous prima donna, an opera singer named Alice Alquist. On this dark, foggy London night, the neighbors of Thornton Square look on in pity and concern as Alice's young niece, barely a teenager, is ushered out of the family home, a stately 3-story mansion at 9 Thornton Square. She wears all black, a black dress, a black veil. Her name is Paula, and her aunt is dead. Her mother died in childbirth, and she never knew her father. So Paula now finds herself all alone. The girl is in a catatonic state as she's ushered into a stagecoach. She's told by the adults around her to not look back. She's told to forget everything that happened here in London. Her life is about to change dramatically. She's headed to Italy to train with a man named Signora Guardi, her aunt's very best friend. She's going to be trained to be a great singer just like her aunt. Look to the future, she's told, not the past. Fast forward a decade later, where Paula, Ingrid Bergman, is now in her early 20s. She's living in Italy and training as an opera singer. And through the windows of an Italian conservatory, we can hear her soft songbird warblings. And we know Mr. Guardi has realized his promise. She's an incredible talent, a prima donna in training, just like her Aunt Alice. But as she sings by the piano, Mr. Guardi can't help but notice that there's something wrong. Paula, her heart doesn't seem to be into opera singing. Her heart seems to belong to something or someone else. When Mr. Guardi confronts Paula about her lack of passion with opera singing, she has to confess. She can't sing the dramatic songs of opera because she's just too happy. She's met someone, and she's fallen in love. She expects Mr. Guardi to be disappointed. Guardi is thrilled. With everything that Paula has been through, all of the trauma that she's experienced, he's happy for her. Happiness, he says, is more important than art. We soon learn that her intended is the piano player, a man who accompanies Paula when she sings, and now wants to accompany Paula throughout the rest of her life, as husband and wife. His name is Gregory Anton. He's handsome and amorous and appears utterly smitten with Paula. As they canoodle outside the music school, Gregory, that's Charles Boyer, tells Paula that he can't wait to marry her. Paula is equally smitten with Gregory, but she's also cautious. I don't really know you. But he assures her, I don't know you very well either. But still, he says he can't wait to marry her. He tries to push her concerns to the side. But Gregory, Paula says, I'm not afraid of you. I'm afraid of happiness. Because Paula hasn't known much happiness in her life. She's really only known fear and loneliness. She asks Gregory to give her some time. They've only known each other for 2 weeks. Gregory says he understands, and he assures Paula, I've waited all my life for you. I can wait a little longer. Paula says before they get married, she needs a week to think about it, alone somewhere. So she takes a train to Lake Como. On the train, she meets an older woman, an 1880s true crime obsessive, who's reading a book about a serial killer. This woman says she loves a good murder, and that she's so into murder stories that her family nickname is Bloodthirsty Bessie. Bloodthirsty Bessie tells Paula she's on her way back to London. She lives in this quiet and adorable area called Thornton Square. Thornton Square. Oh, she knows Thornton Square. Her aunt was murdered there. But Paula doesn't like to bring up the past, ever, so she stays quiet. She doesn't say a word when Bloodthirsty Bessie tells Paula about a real-life murder that happened there 10 years earlier. Bessie retells the tragic saga of a famous opera singer who was strangled, how the case was never solved, the killer never found, and the motive never clear. And she adds the last 10 years the house has remained empty. All the same, nothing changed, exactly as it was left 10 years ago. Now, Bloodthirsty Bessie didn't live there back then, so she didn't know Paula, and she doesn't seem to notice that Paula is traumatized. Paula hastily leaves the train for her week alone in Lake Como. Now, you and I know Lake Como as an Italian getaway for modern-day celebrities like George Clooney and Madonna. But this stunning paradise in northern Italy at the base of the Alps has been a vacation destination for the upper classes for centuries. So it makes sense that Paula would seek solace in a tranquil place like Lake Como. What doesn't make sense is when she exits the train, she discovers she's not alone. Out of nowhere, Gregory appears, sneaking up behind her. Gregory says, "You're not angry with me, are you?" After all that murder talk, memories of her aunt in the past that she was told never to think about, Paula is relieved to see Gregory, a glimpse into her future. It doesn't feel like an intrusion. It doesn't feel like an intrusion at all. It feels like a rescue. And in no time, Paula and Gregory are married and enjoying their honeymoon in Italy and talking about their future. Paula is dreaming of all the places they'll travel to. Strangely, Gregory only has one place in mind: London. He tells Paula he's always wanted to live in London. He's always longed for a home of his own in one of those quiet houses in the little London square. Paula now feels compelled to reveal she knows a house just like that. She inherited it from her aunt. a place she swore she'd never go back to because it's a house of horror. And she says that maybe now, with him, it'll be okay. That he makes her so happy and that she feels so safe with him that she could make it work because she's not afraid anymore. So she tells Gregory that she'll do it. They'll move back to Thornton Square, and Gregory will have his dream, even if that means, for Paula, life will soon become a nightmare. So it's pretty obvious to anyone who's watching the movie that Gregory is a shady mofo. That he's got some kind of grift going. But the nature of what he wants and how he plans to get it will take some time to be revealed. The day they arrive at the house, and they open the door, the 3-story home, while stately and no doubt expensive, is claustrophobic and dark and covered in dust and doom. It's nothing but bad memories for Paula. The furniture hidden under the drop cloths and the dusty chandelier hint at its former grandeur. But to Paula, it smells like death. She remembers the night that she came down as a little girl and she saw her aunt in front of the fireplace, on the floor, strangled to death. She never saw who did it. She only had the memories, the awful memories of her aunt's body. And how confused and powerless she felt. "I can't stay here," she says. "I have to get out of here." Gregory insists that they're going to stay. And the way they're going to resolve Paula's reluctance and her fear is by moving all of the aunt's furnishings up into an upper floor that they're going to board off, and they're never going to look at it or think about it or talk about it ever again. This includes an enormous and majestic portrait of her aunt, dressed in the costume of a famous opera where she's dressed as Empress Theodora. Her gown is bejeweled and glorious. That goes upstairs to the locked-away place with just about everything else that her aunt ever owned, locked away with all of Paula's memories. At first it seems Paula can move on, and she's ready to go and invite the neighbors, have some parties, bring new memories to this house. This includes bloodthirsty Bessie, the older woman that she'd met on the train, who is now her neighbor. Bessie's nephew, Brian, played by Joseph Cotton, happens to be visiting. He also happens to be a Scotland Yard detective. But Gregory says no. He wants to be selfish. He loves Paula so much that he wants their honeymoon to last a little longer. But he does invite one woman into the house, a very young and very saucy maid named Nancy, played by Angela Lansbury. There's something about Nancy that really unsettles Paula. There's a contempt that Nancy has for Paula that Paula can feel and that keeps her on edge. Paula doesn't know it, but Gregory has told Nancy that anything that Paula does or anything that Paula wants has to go through him first. There's an unspoken crackle of attraction between the two, a flirtation. At least it seems that way to Nancy. An interest that's further heightened when Nancy discovers the lady of the house isn't well. Paula has put her dreams of being an opera singer on hold, so Gregory can continue with his music compositions. And he tells her he's rented a special little studio space, a place where he can be alone and can think and compose and create his music and his art. And he thinks best at night. But whenever he leaves, things happen in the house. Unsettling sounds, pounding on walls. It feels like there are people all over the house. And the thing that most unsettles Paula are the lights. One night, when Paula's home alone and Gregory's in his studio, she notices the flickering of her gas lamps. The lights flicker just slightly. And what that means to Paula is that there's someone else in the house, someone else in another room, someone else who's lit a gas lamp. Which doesn't make any sense, because Paula's supposed to be alone. By this time, Gregory has pretty much convinced Paula that she's gone mad, that she's forgetful, that she's a kleptomaniac, that she's absent-minded, that she's exhausted, that she's mentally ill and she's not well. And to prove his point, he reveals that her mother didn't actually die in childbirth. Her mother was committed to an asylum. Her mother died in that asylum, and Paula was going to end up just like her mother. This isn't true, but Paula doesn't know what's real and what's not real. That is until the very end of the film, where, thanks to the work of the Scotland Yard detective, she's made aware that Gregory, her husband, isn't who he says he is. He's actually a murderer who, 10 years ago, strangled her aunt in an effort to steal the aunt's priceless jewels. Jewels that were sewn into the costume that she wore as the Empress Theodora. He didn't find them that night 10 years ago. So his whole relationship with Paula was an orchestration to be able to get back and to find those jewels. And Paula was right. There was someone in the house. It was Gregory, who each night would leave their house, go around the back, sneak up the stairs to go to the area where the aunt's things were, and rifle around her stuff to try and find the treasure she was looking for. And the entire time, he was the one making those gaslights flicker, and yet telling her it was all in her head. Paula is so thrown by all of this mind fuckery. She kind of just wants to give up. But spoiler alert here, that's not what happens. Paula does fight back. She confronts Gregory with a fiery speech, one that clinched the Oscar for Ingrid Bergman. And when Gregory's taken away, it appears that there will be a happy Hollywood ending. That Paula and the Scotland Yard detective might have a future together. A real future. The movie ends with a chance at a new beginning. And the last shot is the approving smile of bloodthirsty Bessie. When Gaslight came out in May of 1944, it was a critical and commercial success. So was the next movie based off of a Patrick Hamilton play, Alfred Hitchcock's iconic film, Rope. Those two Hollywood adaptations made Patrick Hamilton quite wealthy, the kind of wealth his father likely dreamed about, maybe lied about. Unfortunately, the one thing Patrick's father did pass down was a troubled relationship with alcohol. Patrick Hamilton died from cirrhosis of the liver and kidney failure in 1962, at the age of 59. Which, strangely, was around the same time the word gaslight entered the Oxford Dictionary. In a fascinating piece that came out this past week in The New Yorker, writer Leslie Jamieson traced the first use of gaslight as a verb to 1961. Roughly 8 years later, two British doctors published an article in a medical journal called The Gaslight Phenomenon. What's interesting is, two of the cases they used as examples of gaslighting weren't men manipulating women. There were cases of women, wives, who were messing with their husbands' minds. The New Yorker piece, which I'll link to in the show notes, describes how one of the wives in the article wanted to have her husband committed to a mental hospital so she could divorce him without penalty. Gaslighting made a few more cameos in psychological circles over the decades, but the book that is credited with making Gaslight go mainstream was by a psychotherapist named Robin Stern. She published a book called The Gaslight Effect in 2007. Robin Stern's book was aimed at women. In her 20 years in practice, she noticed confident, high-achieving women were being caught in demoralizing, destructive, and bewildering relationships. The New Yorker says this in a much smarter way. But my takeaway is the Gaslight Effect was to the mid-2000s what the book Codependent No More was to the 1980s. These epic zeitgeisty books that a lot of us didn't read, but that we like to use the terminology as a convenient shorthand. A way to capture everything from the brazen behavior of a politician to a more subtle but deeply uncomfortable feeling. A gaslight is the flicker, the thing you can't put your finger on. An unpredictable flame that you can't help but stare at, mesmerized, wondering what's going to happen next. A frenetic dance that can cast dark shadows everywhere you look. And I guess the most important thing to remember about a gaslight, as unpredictable as they seem, they're easy to extinguish. Just close your eyes, take a deep breath, and blow out the flame. Thank you again for listening to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I really appreciate the opportunity to experiment with these bedtime stories. I'll be back soon with an all-new true crime story. Until then, nighty-night.